Hi, today we are going to look at Article 4 in our Statement of Faith, and let me read it out to you. Article 4 says that man without exception is by nature and by practice a fallen creature and is consequently under condemnation and unable by any personal merit or works to fit himself for the presence of God. This particular article talks about one subject which people generally don't like to talk about, that is the subject of sin. The above statement that we just read says three things. Firstly, it says that every man is a sinner by nature and practice. Secondly, it says that man is under condemnation or judgment because of sin. And thirdly, it says that man is unable by his own personal merit or works to make himself acceptable to God. Firstly, to enable us to dive into this subject of sin, we have to define sin. We have to look at the meaning of sin. Now, there are a number of words used in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament to translate the word sin. We won't look at all of them, but we'll look at two particular words that's used in the New Testament that should be sufficient to help us to get our minds around this subject of sin and understand what it means. The first is the Greek word hamartia, which means missing the mark. So this would, if the ancient Greeks want to describe an archer shooting an arrow at a target but missing the target, this is the word that's used to describe the missing of the mark. So this word is used in Romans chapter 3 verse 23, where Paul says, for all have sinned, and he used the Greek word hematon, which is a verb form of the word hamartia. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Fall short of the glory of God. That helps us to understand what sin is really all about. Sin is basically failing to attain to the standard God demands of man. So it refers to committing acts which are contrary to God's demands. So that's the positive form of it. There's also the negative aspect of it, and it refers to omissions as well. James chapter 4 verse 7 says, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. So that's the first word that's used to translate the word sin that we want to look at. Failing to meet God's standard, failing to meet the expectations or the level that God expects of man. The second word is the Greek word parabasis, which means overstepping or transgression. Just imagine a line drawn on the ground or a boundary. So you are not supposed to cross that. If you cross that line, you cross that boundary, then you are transgressing. You are overstepping the limit. So an example of the use of this word is in Romans chapter 5 verse 14, which says, nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin, by breaking a command, as did Adam, who was a pattern of the one to come. Complicated verse, but the word sin, translated from the word parabasis, is used there. So it speaks of breaking a command. So the law of God, the commands of God, is like a line drawn in the sand. This is what you must do. You cannot cross it. You break the command, you are crossing, you are overstepping the line, you are transgressing the border which you shouldn't transgress. So therefore, if you could sum up the meaning of both these Greek words. So we can say that sin is both a failure to meet God's standards, and it is also a violation of God's express moral commands. Okay, let's just look very quickly at this idea of the universality of sin, because the first article says that man, without exception, is a fallen creature. So sin is a condition of the entire human race. Sin is not a problem of some people, and that there are other people who don't have a problem of sin. So sin infects the entire human race. There is no exception. So there could be men and women who are great moral examples, really good people, and you could write stories and you could tell stories about them, you could write books about them. No matter how good they are, the Bible tells us there is no human being who is not a sinner. So we think of the Mother Teresa's, the Mahatma Gandhis, no matter how great they are morally and ethically, they are still sinners. There is no human being who is not a sinner. So Paul in Romans chapter 3 verse 9 to 18, which is reproduced in your notes, this is what he says, and he backs it up by giving a quotation of various Old Testament verses, all put together. He says, Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. So look at the words Paul uses: without exception, all are under the power of sin. As it is written, and he begins to quote from the Old Testament, one passage after another, there is no one righteous, not even one. There's no one righteous, not even one. There's no one who understands. There's no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There's no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves, their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers are on their lips, their mouths are full of bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood, ruin and misery. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. So, Paul not only believes that all men are sinners, but he quotes the Old Testament, a litany of passages written by different writers of the Old Testament to show that they too take the same view, that all men are sinners. So, therefore, man, without exception, there is there is no exception as far as sin is concerned. All men are sinners. Later, Paul will say in Romans chapter 3 verse 23, all have sinned. All have sinned. We looked at that verse earlier. Now, to understand the nature of sin in man, we have to look at this subject called original sin, because the article of faith that we just looked at, that we have said that man without exception is by nature and practice a fallen creature. He is by nature a fallen creature. So, and this brings us to the subject of original sin. David in Psalm chapter 51 verse 5 says, surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Now, when David wrote these words in Psalm 51, he was not suggesting that his mother had committed adultery, that he was born in sin. He wasn't suggesting that at all. David had just had this terrible experience where he committed adultery and he murdered his lover's husband. And he was rebuked by the prophet and exposed, and he repented, and because of his remorse he wrote Psalm 51, in which we find this particular verse. Now, David was struggling to understand the whole idea of sin and how it infected his life. And he recognized that he, like all men, was a sinful creature, and that his sinful condition predates his birth. David was not saying that I was born a good man. I've been a good man my whole life, and there was just this one moment where I lapsed into sin. In fact, David recognized that he was sinful not only throughout his whole life, and that was why it was so easy for him to commit those terrible sins. But David even had this idea that even before he was born, during the time of conception, he was already infected by sin. So, and David did not realize it, but he was actually describing for us this concept that I just mentioned, the concept of original sin. So original sin is the sinful state or condition in which every human being is born. The word original is used because it is rooted in Adam. The word original is used because it is rooted in Adam. And original sin is the source of actual sins, the sins that we actually commit. Because of the first sin committed by Adam, every man was born with a sinful nature and is under condemnation. So the consequences of original sin, which we'll try to understand in a few moments, is two things: guilt and pollution. Firstly, let's look at guilt. Right? Let's look at guilt, which is a consequence of original sin. Now, guilt is a judicial concept. We are familiar with that when we read something about a court case that's going on, a criminal that's tried in court is either found guilty or is found innocent. So guilt is a judicial concept, and it refers to the legal standing of a person. For the criminal in the court, it refers to his legal standing in the eyes of the law of the land. As far as we are concerned, it refers to our standing in the eyes of God. We participate in Adam's guilt from the moment we are born. As long as we are human beings, we share in the sin of Adam. Where is this from? Okay, where does the Bible teach something like this? Let's go to Romans chapter 5. Romans chapter 5. And we're going to go through this profound passage. It's not easy to understand, and we've got to unpack it carefully, slowly and carefully, so that we know what Paul was talking about. So we read Romans chapter 5 verse 12. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all men, because all sinned. Okay, so what is Paul saying here? Paul saying that sin entered into the world and brought with it death, and it was because of one man, Adam. Because of one man, Adam, sin came into the world, and death came along with sin. And in this way, death came to all men because all sin. Now the words "in this way" is very important. Paul was not saying that therefore like this or in a similar way sin and death came to all men. What he's saying is that because of that sin of Adam, right? In this way refers to the particular sin of Adam that is mentioned earlier. Because of that particular sin of Adam, death came to all men because all sinned. So here we have this complex idea that because of Adam's sin, death came to everybody. Why? Because when Adam sinned, all sinned. Alright, so what is Paul talking about here? So basically Paul is saying something like we are responsible for Adam's sin. So when Adam committed sin, he not only suffered the consequences of his sin, but we also suffered the consequences of his sin. His sin was not just peculiar to himself, it touched us as well. It was as if we sinned. When Adam sinned, Even though we have not been born yet, right now we live, we do not know, thousands of years after Adam, long after committed that first sin. But the very fact of being human means that we share in that sin. Because of that sin of Adam, we sinned, we died. So why are we responsible for Adam's sin? Paul here was introducing the idea of what we call federal headship. To put it in simple words, it means the idea of one man representing or being the leader of the whole of mankind. So when Adam sinned, his sin and guilt was attached to all the people he represented. So when Adam sinned in the Garden of Eden, he was representing us. Now perhaps we can better understand this when we look at the story of David and Goliath. You know, that battle between David and Goliath, it best illustrates what we are talking about. Now, the battle between the Israelites and the Philistines reached this stage where there was something like a stalemate. The armies were facing each other, but neither of them dared to make a move. Not a single person dared to take a step forward, and they just were staring at each other. So that's when Goliath, the giant, the Philistine giant, came out and he challenged the army of Israel. Pick one man to fight me. So eventually, of course, we know from the story that none of the Israelites had the courage to face Goliath, except David, a shepherd boy. So eventually, David and Goliath faced each other in the battlefield. Two men. They were champions for their people, for their nation. And the fate of one man would determine the fate of the entire nation. And this was what Goliath said in 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 9. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your slaves. Goliath is saying, if the Israelite champion can kill me, then all the Philistines will become the slaves of the Israelites. And then he goes on to say, but if I overcome and kill him, you, that means the nation of Israel, will become our subjects and serve us. So, in a similar way, Adam was representing the entire human race when he was tested by God in the Garden of Eden. When Adam sinned, when he committed the first sin in the Garden of Eden, he sinned not only as an individual, but he also sinned as our representative. Thus, we are guilty and under condemnation because of that first sin. Now, the words "because all sinned" in Romans chapter 5 verse 12 that we just looked at indicates that in the Garden of Eden, God saw all human beings sinning through Adam. All right? Now, that's what Paul said in Romans chapter 5 verse 12. Now, how does Paul support a teaching like this? How does Paul prove that what he had just said is correct? So, we read verse 13 and 14. Paul goes on to justify what he had just said. For before the law was given, sin was in the world. But sin is not taken into account when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking a command, as did Adam, who was a pattern of the one to come. So let's look at this carefully. What was Paul saying here? Paul was saying that, all right, we know Adam was tested in the Garden of Eden. God gave Adam a command. Do not eat the fruit of this tree. If you eat it, you will die. So God gave Adam a command. And Adam failed to obey God. He broke that command. Now, the next time when God gave commands to the human race, to people, was during the time of Moses, when God gave the 10 Commandments and other laws to the time of Moses. So when you study your Bible, between Adam and Moses, there was actually no law, so to speak. God did not give a command to anybody in the human race that they must follow. So the only command was given to Adam in the Garden of Eden, and he broke that command. So that command was exhausted. So when we look at the Bible from that point on up to the time of Moses, God did not command anybody to do anything or not to do anything. So, and everybody understands, Paul understands that sin is breaking God's law. We looked at the two words to describe sin is breaking God's law or God's command. Okay, when you break God's law, you sin, and as a consequences, death follows. So death is the consequence or the result of sin, and sin is the breaking of God's command. But Paul said that before the law was given during Moses' time, he said sin was already in the world. Okay? Why did Paul say sin was already in the world? Well, in verse 14 he says, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses. So, death could only exist if there is sin. So, during the time of, so he backs up his statement. He says that during the time of from Adam to Moses, there was sin in the world. How do we know there was sin in the world? Because there was death. Alright? But then, earlier in verse 13, Paul makes the point that sin is not taken into account where there is no law. In other words, he says that if there is no law, there cannot be sin. Why? Because the definition of sin is breaking God's law. Now, if God did not give a law, how can there be sin? I hope you follow the logic of Paul. So, Paul was making this observation that from Adam's time to Moses' time, there was no law, but yet people died. People died during this period. And we know that people die because of sin. And sin is the breaking of God's law. But during this period, there was no law. So, why did people die? Okay? So, because there was no law before the time of Moses, sin should not exist, right? That's the logic of it. Sin should not exist, and if sin should not exist, then there should be no death. But yet, during this time, all men died. So, how can death exist when there is no law to break? That's basically what Paul was saying. And the only way to explain why people die was because human beings share in the sin of Adam. People died because of sin. There's no doubt about that. During that period from Adam to Moses. But the sin that caused their death was the sin of Adam. So, we go on to read Paul's logic that human beings were guilty because of the sin of Adam, and that's why they were sentenced to death. So in verse 15, he says, the many died by the trespass of one man. The many died. That means human beings died by the trespass of one man. And who's that one man? Adam. And what is that trespass? The sin that Adam committed in the Garden of Eden. And then in verse 16, Paul says, the judgment followed one sin and brought condemnation. The judgment followed one sin, Adam's sin, and it brought condemnation. In verse 18, the result of one trespass was condemnation for all men. So the result of one trespass, that's Adam's sin, was condemnation for all men. So, therefore, Paul is saying that even if you did not commit sin, you would die anyway because you share in Adam's sin. Alright? This would put paid to the argument that people would have that well, if I try hard enough, if I don't break any of God's commands, and that if I don't break any of God's commands, then I wouldn't sin and I wouldn't die. But the fact remains that you still will die. Right? Even if you are capable of not sinning, but you still die. So why do you still die? Because you may not commit actual sin, but you have original sin. The sin by which is a result of Adam's sin in the Garden of Eden. Now, the reason why Paul talked about original sin was not because that was his focus. His focus was actually on salvation, justification through Jesus Christ. So, what he said, he explains this further in verse 15. He says, but the gift from God is not like the trespass. For if the many died by the trespass of the one man, how much more did God's grace and the gift that came by the grace of one man, Jesus Christ, overflow for the many? Again, the gift of God is not like the result of one man's sin. The judgment followed one sin and brought condemnation, but the gift followed many trespasses and brought justification. For if by the trespass of one man death reigned through that one man, how much more will those who receive God's abundant provision of grace and the gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ? What Paul eventually wanted to say was that the way in which we can be justified before God, the way in which our sins could be forgiven and we could be accepted by God, is not because of what we have done, but because of what Jesus Christ has done. Jesus Christ, one man, obeyed God. As a result of one man's obedience, many people like us, many were made righteous. Many experienced or received justification. And Paul was trying to show that it is something like what happened with Adam. Adam was the head of the human race. Because he sinned, he brought death to all men. Jesus Christ was the second head of the human race. He obeyed and he brought justification to all men. So the mechanics are similar, but the content are different. In one case, the first man, Adam, sinned. The second man, Jesus Christ, obeyed. Because of the first man's sin, many died. But because of the second man's obedience, many lived. So, through Adam came death to all men, but through Christ came life to all men. So both Adam and Christ were representative heads of mankind. Their respective act of sin and obedience brought death and life respectively to all men. So therefore, it is one thing to say that we are guilty of sin because of the sinful actions that we ourselves commit. But apart from that, we are also sinners. We are also under the judgment of God because we share in the sin of Adam, original sin. Now, we go to the next aspect of original sin. Original sin results in guilt for us. The next part, which touches closer to home, is the idea of pollution. The idea of pollution. And we are not talking about environmental pollution here, we are talking about moral pollution. Adam's sin led to the sinful corruption of all human beings who descended from him. The sin of one man, Adam, polluted the rest of mankind. It polluted the rest that followed. And there are two aspects to pollution. The first aspect is what I call total depravity. Total depravity. And it refers to the extent of the pollution of our souls. Now, when we use the term total depravity, we are not saying that every human being is completely evil or is totally depraved. So you can think of a lot of stories, wicked witches, for example, people with demonic personalities, people who are so violent, brutal, and immoral, and so inhuman. There are stories like that. Okay, total depravity is not saying that we human beings are totally depraved, that we are completely wicked and evil. It's not saying that. What it says is that the corruption, firstly, the corruption that is the result of sin extends to every aspect of our human nature. Right? The corruption resulting from sin extends to every aspect of our human nature. It affects the mental part of us, it affects our emotions, it affects our motives, our values and attitude. In fact, it affects everything about us. So sin is not something that affects one part of our body or our personalities. It affects everything. So when we sin, it's not just that it affects our mouth. When we sin, it's not just that it affects our actions, it affects our minds as well, it affects our emotions. So sin corrupts every aspect of our nature. And secondly, as a result of this pollution, there is no natural love for God. So that's the other very important aspect of total depravity. There is no natural love for God. Now, God created man. He put his breath into man, and he even said that man is made after his image. So logically, man would have an affinity towards God. He would tend to love God. He would tend to want to seek after God. But when we look at human beings, they don't have this tendency. People, the more natural tendency is to reject God, to reject belief in God. So there is no natural love of God in man because of sin. Alright, so total depravity means that sin corrupts every aspect of our human nature, and the most important part of it that it corrupts is actually that spiritual part of it. It corrupts our soul and our spirit, so much so that we don't have a natural love for God. The other aspect of pollution is total inability. Total inability. And this refers to the impotency that exists in us that resulted from the pollution of sin. Okay? What impotency are we talking about? Okay? Well, immediately we can think that the impotency to do good, that we are not able to do good. Now, total inability does not mean that human beings are totally unable to do any good. That is not true. We look at ourselves, we look at the people around us. People can do good. They do evil, they sin, they do bad things and wrong things, but they can also do right things. So when we talk about total inability, we are not saying that people are unable to do good. Okay? Now, what total inability really means is that it means that unregenerate man, as long as a man is a sinner, he cannot do what God expects him to do. He can do a lot of things. He can contribute to charity. He can build religious places of worship. He can contribute to society. He can do a lot of good, but the one good that really matters, he cannot do. And that good is what God expects of him. So, sinful man can do a lot of things, but he cannot do what God expects of him. And the very basic thing that God expects of sinful man is to believe in God, to seek after God, to exercise faith. And that's something that sinful man cannot do. There's no natural love for God in him. So how can he do all these things? So total inability means that man cannot do what God expects him to do. And apart from the empowerment of the Holy Spirit, a man cannot change his condition. So man is by himself is unable to go to God. He's unable to do anything that will result in him being saved, being forgiven, being acceptable in the presence of God. Unless the Holy Spirit intervenes in the life of that person, that man cannot change his condition. Only God can change him. Now, having said this, I think we need to back up an observation like this. Is it substantiated by observation? Is it substantiated by the records of humankind? Okay, is it true that mankind generally cannot or will not do what God wants him to do? He will always go away from God. Instead of seeking God, he will always disobey rather than obey. He will rather displease God rather than to please God. When we look at human history, especially recorded for us in the Bible, and we can look beyond the Bible, we can see that human history is marked by the mass movement towards sin. If mankind is going one direction, if it is in the direction of sin. So man does not get better, but worse, because of the pollution of sin. And the Bible describes the moral condition of man at different times in human history. Let's take the time of Noah. Now that would be the period of human civilization before the flood. And you are talking about 1,000 to 2,000 years after the creation of Adam. So you're talking about human society that is very close to the creation of the world, very close to the creation of the first man and woman. So they were very close to the acts of God in creating the world and creating man. And you would expect human conscience and human religion to be purer than what it is right now, which is such a long time after that period. But within the first 1,000 to 2,000 years after God created man, this was what happened to the human race. In Genesis chapter 6 verse 5, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. And then we go to verse 12 of Genesis chapter 6. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So Genesis chapter 6 said that when God looked at mankind, all had become corrupt. All had become corrupt. And God also saw the intensity of the wickedness, the intensity of sin in the human race. He saw that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. I can't think of more accurate language to describe depravity. So when we look at the human race at that time, God's judgment is that everybody in the human race had become evil, and therefore God decided to destroy the world. And now just imagine that if man was good, if man was capable of good and capable of obeying God and pleasing God, living a life that pleases God, how many percent of the human race would be like this? People who can please God. 50%. You may think that, oh, maybe that's too much. Okay, 40%, maybe 30%. How about we go lower? Maybe only 10% of the human race can live in such a way to please God. But when we look at Noah's time, God chose one man, Noah, to survive the flood. And he had his small family with him. So 3 sons with their wives, Noah, his wife, his 3 sons and their wives, 8 people. But his sons came along for the boat ride because they are part of Noah's family. So out of the entire human race, can you imagine, out of the entire human race, there was only one person that God saw fit to save. And I'm not even saying that or suggesting that all men in the world at that time are sinners except Noah. I'm not saying that Noah was not a sinner. Now if you look at Noah after the flood, there are some pretty terrible stories, some moral lapses on his part. So Noah was not perfect. God chose him for the survival of the human race. So can you imagine, out of the entire human race, only one was worthy enough to be saved? Wasn't that 10%? Wasn't that 5%? Wasn't that 3%? It's so pathetic, only one. Now let's look at King David's time. When was that? Probably about, we are not sure, could be about at least 1,500 years after Noah, who knows. And during King David's time, in the year somewhere around 1000 BC, 1000 years before Christ, this is what David had to say. All, again we see the word all have turned away, all have become corrupt. And just in case we don't get the full force of what David was trying to say, he butters it by these words: there is no one who does good, not even one. That's Psalm 14 verse 3. There is no one who does good, not even one. So King David, during his time. Now we go 300 years later, during the time of Isaiah. Isaiah says, we all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us, every one of us, have turned to our own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. When Isaiah used the word all, he was referring to his nation, the nation of Israel, the chosen people of God, the people who received the law of God, the people who saw the miracles, who were delivered by God from Egypt. They saw the miracle of the parting of the Red Sea. They were fed miraculously with bread from heaven during the 40 years in the desert. So they had all the opportunity to be good people. But did they turn out like that? Isaiah says, all we like sheep have gone astray. If we jump to the New Testament, during the time of Paul, around 50 AD, Paul, writing about 20 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, as he wrote his epistle to the Romans, he said this in Romans chapter 3 verse 22 to 23. This righteousness is given through faith in Christ to all who believe. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So yes, the Jews were the descendants of Abraham, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In their history, they had illustrious people like Moses, David, Solomon, and the prophets, but they were no better than the Gentile as far as sin is concerned. Okay, lastly, we look at the subject of the consequences of sin, which is condemnation. Just as all men are by nature and practice a fallen creature, all men are condemned because of it. Okay. Now, as sin entered the world, it brought death along with it. Just as righteousness and obedience to God meant life, Disobedience and rebellion meant death. And God warned Adam of the consequences of disobedience. He said to Adam in Genesis chapter 2 verse 17, "You must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." So basically God was telling Adam that if you disobey, if you sin, you will die. And when God used the word die, he refers to physical death. He refers to human death. Now since then, death has been an unalterable feature of human existence. It is said that there are two certainties in life, death and taxes. Death is a certainty in life. It is the external manifestation of man's separation from God as a result of his sin. God is the source of all life. When man sins, he separates himself from God. And he separates himself from the source of all life. So it is no wonder that physically he will die. So death robs man of the enjoyment of the full blessings that God intended man to have when he created him. So that's human death. Now beyond human death, there is also what we call the eschatological death. Okay? And that is the eternal state of punishment and separation from God following God's judgment of sinners. And people refer to it as the afterlife. After your life, after you have died, you have to face God. There will be a judgment, and God will judge you. And when you fail that judgment, to use a popular term, you will go to hell, and you will suffer eternal punishment. And such a thing does exist. Hebrews chapter 9 verse 27 says, "Just as people are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment." Okay? One thing we can be certain in life is that we will die. And just as certain as death is the fact of judgment after death. That's what Hebrews says. Now this is called the second death. And it is a fate far worse than death. The first death is physical death. But when one is judged by God and found wanting, he suffers what the Bible calls a second death. So the term second death is used in the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 20 verse 14, we read, "Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire." The lake of fire is the second death. And in Revelation chapter 21 verse 8, it reads, "But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur." This is the second death. And the feature that stands out above everything else in the second death is the absence of the presence of God. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 9, Paul writes, "They will be punished with everlasting destruction and shut out from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might." Now when we talk about heaven and hell, we have a problem of trying to describe it, trying to imagine it. What is heaven like? What is hell like? And we know that heaven always generates ideas of happiness, peace, serenity, comfort, all the positive experiences, and hell generates ideas of the opposite: pain, suffering, loneliness, darkness, anguish, things like that. Heaven is eternal bliss, hell is eternal suffering. But perhaps the best way to understand heaven and hell is that heaven is where God is. If you're in heaven, you're in the presence of God. And because you're in the presence of God, you experience all the blessings that comes from God. Hell is where God is not. God is not there in hell. So, away from God, people experience none of the blessings that come from God. They experience the blessing that come from eternal separation from God. So, this is the second death. And because of the powerful ideas that's connected with condemnation and judgment and the second death, it gives us the motivation to share the gospel with our loved ones, with our friends, with the people that we come into contact with people whom we do not know. Man needs to hear the gospel. Man needs to know Jesus Christ so that they can be saved from this terrible eternal fate. So that's the exposition of the fourth article in our statement of faith. Have a nice day, have a nice week, and if you enjoyed this this presentation and you found it helpful and want to be kept updated on future videos on our statement of faith or about the teachings of our assembly, please click on the subscribe button below. Thank you.